everyone. I'm Peter Freer. I'm the founder and CEO of Play Attention, and thank you for being with us today for Neuroplasticity Unlocked. Now, as I do in every one of my webinars, I'm going to ask you, if you are watching me on a computer, please mute your cell phone or turn off your messaging. Or if you're watching me on your cell phone, please turn off your messaging. One of the things that is imperative to understanding neuroplasticity and understanding how it actually sparks is attention. And so this is a problem for many of us, that we have an inability to pay attention to any one thing for a period of time. So to get the most out of this webinar, if you would, just focus in and let's go ahead and learn something together. Now, I'm obviously very, very happy that you're here. And what I'll be doing today is presenting a lot of information regarding neuroplasticity. In doing so, I will be taking it from a very large perspective. As a matter of fact, let's just go ahead and move to the agenda so you can see what we're going to be doing today. We'll talk about what neuroplasticity actually is, then how the brain actually is affected by it, how the ADHD brain is affected by it, and examples of it. How do we spark it? And by sparking it, I mean, how do we initiate neuroplasticity? Because we do have control of it. And we'll be looking at that from an overall perspective, from a very large perspective, all the way down to a micro perspective. The perspective in micro actually will look at the brain chemistry behind it, the processes behind it that actually make this happen. So there is a lot of fun that we'll have today and a lot that we can learn. Now, I do tend to speak on the more scientific side, but today, since people have told me, well, I need you to bring it down to my level. So I'll not only do it on the scientific side, but let's have fun and we'll talk about it from a very practical side. So it's easy to understand. So I'll be explaining it in 2 or 3 different ways, every one of these topics, so that it should resonate with you one way or the other. And that way we can all understand and enjoy the information that is shared today. So what exactly is neuroplasticity? We know neuro, meaning your brain, that's the easy part. But this other word, plasticity, that has a root in it as well. And that root is plastic, right? And plastic is rather an ambiguous term, because if we talk about plastic today, we talk about something that's rather hard, like this circuit board right here, right? That's hard, that's plastic. In the cover of my computer, it's plastic and it's hard. So it's rather an ambiguous term in the way that it is used today, currently. But it emanates from the Latin word plasticus, which comes from the Greek term plastikos or plastos, which means, and this is highlighted, right? I've actually boldfaced this, molded or formed. So neuro, brain, and then we understand that the brain can be molded or formed. So this is rather a disambiguation, right? So ambiguation. We just want to make certain we are not being ambiguous, right? I want everyone here to understand that the word plastic, as we're using it, is not this hard, we're not turning the brain into a hard plastic substance. It means that the brain is very moldable or shapeable, right? Now, what is it exactly? Right? It is also known, neuroplasticity is also known as brain plasticity. So at times when if you're viewing other webinars, you're hearing other speakers discuss this topic, they may call it brain plasticity. It's the same as neuroplasticity. So what it actually helps us do as humans is that we can rewire and reorganize. Now, this is a very important part of the human brain, but is it only common to human beings? The answer is no. Everything from ants to humans can have neuroplasticity. Their brains will change. And that's how it is a major survival mechanism for a species. Because if we could not, then we would simply die off. If we could not rewire and reorganize as needs arise, as a species, we would die off. So it is not just a human capability, it is also throughout the animal kingdom. So external factors spark, and we're using the word spark here as a synonym of initiate the brain, right? External factors will initiate or compel the brain to augment, to change in some way so that it's different from the way it previously functioned. That's the essence of neuroplasticity. So it is also a process that involves adaptive and structural changes, right? So it requires the rewiring and reorganization actually produce structural changes, and which the structural changes actually propel functional changes so that we not only change the structure of the brain, rewire the brain, but that rewiring helps us function typically better than we did before. That's what neuroplasticity is. And it's not something that, how can we say it? It's not something that is just particular to humans, but it is something that we've studied for many years now. And we have a very good idea of now how it happens on the overall level, right, that we live in constantly, and how it happens on the micro level inside the brain itself, which is quite interesting. And it gives us, when you go to a webinar, you attend a webinar like this, you can be, if you listen carefully, especially about the topic of neuroplasticity, if you listen carefully, your brain will start to change. It can be a very empowering lesson today. So that's why I asked you to tune in and pay attention, because that's one of the critical components of being able to spark neuroplasticity. We'll go into that in greater detail. So obviously, it gives us the ability to learn. And so this is not a theory, right? Neuroplasticity is a fact, right? It's not a theory, and it's not something that I invented. It's not something someone else invented. It is a fact of a process. It's a way to describe a process in the brain. And it is factual. So it's not just a theory that, I'm relying on to tell you about how things function. This is how we've actually observed this world. And we can repeat it in experiments. And I'll go into that over and over again in the webinar today. But the important bullet point here, all of these are really important, but the second one gives us the ability to change behaviorally and psychologically. That's huge. Because I know many of you, if you're a parent here of an ADHD child, obviously this is brought to you by Play Attention, the company that I founded. Many of you are here and you've thrown up your hands and you're saying, I have no clue how to manage my child. And some of you are saying that about yourself. Some of you may be ADHD. I don't know what to do. I have no place to start. I have no idea about how to meet these challenges in my life. And what we're talking about when we're discussing neuroplasticity is the fact that we can meet those challenges. Neuroplasticity is the process, right? Process between what we are now and how we make change. So who is the captain of our mind? Who is the captain of our brain? And this is what's important to understand. This is some of the empowerment that you'll experience today if you listen carefully. Can anyone answer that? Who is the captain of our brain, all right, of your brain. Who is the captain? Anyone answer that? Yeah. Janelle says, we are. Gwenna, ourselves. Absolutely. We are the captains. But it's important that we realize that. And today's webinar is based upon the fact that I will show you how it works. I'll give you tips and strategies on how we can make these significant changes. This is something I've specialized in for the last 30 years. And actually, I'm undergoing the process of neuroplasticity right now. I have years of martial arts training, many years, and my knees were completely shot. So I had what is called a bilateral knee replacement. And this was 8 weeks ago. I had both of my knees replaced. I am now studying on how to use my new knees. My brain is adapting. It's not adapting as fast as I'd like, but I am way ahead of the game. Understanding neuroplasticity, when I go to see my PT advisors, my physical therapist, and my surgeon that actually did the replacement, when I went to see them, they said, well, you're weeks ahead of where you're supposed to be. You're 2 months ahead of where a person with both knees getting replaced typically is. The reason for that is I understand neuroplasticity. I understand the work it takes to retrain myself. So this is all part and parcel of me empowering myself. So I'm months ahead of where I should be. I would like to be even months ahead of that. But the ability to flex my knees, to straighten my legs, to get my balance back has all been greatly increased by my ability to understand what neuroplasticity is and how I spark it. I hope that makes sense. So this is one major, I'm going to give you more examples later, but in itself, I am a major example of using it to move along in life and change my brain so that I can pick up new skills. So what I want to talk about how it's related to the brain and what the brain is, and this is kind of fun. So the brain obviously is comprised of billions of cells. And these are called neurons. There are about as many billions, I think it's about 100, between 100 and 200 billion neurons. And this almost, Carl Sagan, the great cosmologist from years past, used to say, you know, there are about the same number of cells in our brain as there are stars in our galaxy. Very similar. In order for the brain to work, those neurons have to talk to each other. To function normally, those neurons must communicate. They must be able to tell the other neurons around them how well you're breathing. Is your balance good? Are you hungry? So they all have to talk among these networks of each other. And they do form networks. And they actually form organs in the brain that perform specific activities, right? For example, today we're going to talk about the hippocampus. In the brain, if you could look right past your ear and look in on both sides, you have a little seahorse-shaped organ that is the center of memory and learning. And that is greatly affected by neuroplasticity. We'll discuss that. So this is a very organized set of cells that have a specific function in the brain. And for those of us who are saying, okay, this idea of neurons, it's way too complex for me. To make it even clearer, I know almost everyone here has a cell phone with them. Cell phones are based on the way that our brains function. You have one of those little bright spots that you see lit up here. You have one of those billions of phones or cells, cell phone, in a larger cell phone network. So if your phone stops working, then it's a paperweight. It has no function. Its function is to be able to communicate to the larger network, which is comprised of every other cell phone on the planet. And the brain is actually working, the same way. Cell phones are based on that. Is that making sense? If it is, can you give me a hands up? So I'm trying to make it easier to follow rather than being, oh, thank you. Super, super. Okay. So this makes it easier to understand about how these things actually function within the way the brain actually operates. All right. So we want to make certain that we understand that these cells can be rearranged. And we'll talk about that. The brain itself is composed of what we call gray matter. And it's usually, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, I'm roaming around on the outside, which is the surface of what is called the cortex out here. Above that white matter is the gray matter. Now, the gray matter is what essentially allows us to process data. A lot of processing of data is handled by the gray matter. Now, the white matter below it is kind of the glue that connects us and sends all of that processed information to the various regions of the body. And if you see the white matter and what's underneath it, they're called the corona radiata. And you see that that's attached down below it to the spinal cord. It's running down and it's attached all the way to the base of the brain and the spinal cord. Now, if you can see that, this means, to make certain that we're all on the same page, this means that our computer is primarily involved in the processing of information on the surface of the cortex. Those data are transmitted to the white matter, which again sends it down through every region of our body. So if we looked at ourselves as a network, our network is wired from the very top of our computer throughout every region of our body, to our fingertips, all the way down to the very tips of our toes. And these are physical wires called nerves. So when we're talking about neuroplasticity, we're talking about changing the way the computer functions up here. But this computer is actually attached, and you can see all the little micro attachments there in the corona radiata. This is connected all over the body, from head to tip of toe. I hope this makes sense. Now, this is important to understand, because once we change the way this operates, we change the way that our body functions. It could be behaviorally, it could be psychologically. All right. And it actually could be physically. And I'll discuss that with you in just a moment. Now, I know that some of you will have questions. And at the very end of the webinar, I will address questions. So we can have an interactive exchange at that point. So please save them for the end. I'd be delighted to discuss them with you at that time. Now, there's a huge myth. You notice that little question I like to put down at the bottom of the page? Do we only use our 20% of our brains? And I don't know why the word on is in it. Do we only use 20% of our brains? Because everybody says, oh, we don't, Einstein used all of his brain. We only use 20% of our brains. Well, that's absolute nonsense. Right? There is no reason in the world that only 20% of our brains are used. We use all of the capabilities of the brain. How well we use it, that depends on a lot of factors. But the myth that we only use 20% of our brains is just absolute nonsense. I just like to throw that in on occasion, because it's good to know that there are some things that are true myths, and we should straighten them out. What is neuroplasticity's relationship to an ADHD brain? Now, we just showed you gray matter and white matter, right? We know typically that an ADHD brain is anywhere from 2 to 3 years behind the development of a neurotypical brain. So this is important. This is empowering for you if you're a parent or a teacher or a counselor. and you're working with a child, let's say, and it could be yourself that is ADHD, right? You may be ADHD. And I'll use the example though, for just to talk about how the slower development actually influences or affects the way an ADHD brain functions. Um, if you have been working with a child and you teach them multiplication tables, you get the flashcards out. There's a test coming up, and you teach them multiplication tables. And for a while, for that evening, they're getting a good score. They could make 80 to 90% of that test the following day. Your child takes the test and they fail badly. Very poor performance. And you're like, how in the world could you do it here? You get to a classroom and you cannot do it there. And then you say, well, let's study again. You take the flashcards out and they don't look like they've ever seen them before. They don't acknowledge, they have no idea what you're talking about. It's like you're starting afresh, starting over again. Does this resonate with anyone? Because you probably, if you have an ADHD child, you probably have experienced this over and over and over again. So if you do, if it does resonate, just raise your hand, and because you'll see that there's a great inconsistency. The brain has not developed incredibly well. It's delayed, and so it actually happens that we get inconsistent outcomes. Sometimes we are able to understand for a little while, other times we don't, because we have less gray matter. We have less, since it's underdeveloped, we have less matter that is helping process all of these data. This also leads to difficulty in all of these things below it here. These are called executive functions. I'll go into this in more detail later. But executive functions are skill sets that we expect everybody to have. But an ADHD brain is either weak in some or all, or doesn't have them at all. Some impulse control is a major problem. You probably have seen this over and over again with your child or yourself. You cannot control impulses or your child. And so then you have planning and prioritizing. That's weak. Organization that's weak. Working memory that's weak. Emotion regulation. Attention is diffused most of the time. They have plenty of it. It's just scattered. Task initiation or time management. All of these are incredibly important, but the brain is not developed quite right to, or quite enough to have attained them, because they are skills. And I'll give this as a general question. If they are skills that the brain is supposed to have, and my brain is developing slowly or more differently than a neurotypical, how is it I am to get these skills if I don't have them or they're weak? Can anyone explain that to me? Difficult, isn't it? There's not one answer so far. All right. Toby says extra work. And that is true. It does take extra work, but it takes a very specific kind of work. Catherine is saying, well, I have to be taught them. Absolutely. And as I said when I started this, I am the fellow that originated the idea for play attention. And so I knew that ADHD was a problem of executive function. The brain was not developed to have these skills. So that's what I did. I set up an entire program, worked for 6 years to develop that, working with information from NASA. It was just an incredibly complex way to do it, but we worked out this fantastic program that teaches these skills directly. And I'll go into that a little bit later, but this was the whole basis for using and developing play attention, so that we actually had a way to do this work. Because if I don't, most of us, if you don't have ADHD, most of us pick this up just through our interactions with the world, with our family as we're growing up, because our first interactions with our family are some of the most important. They're the ones that teach us, how do I plan for this? How do I stay organized? Even if it's just learning to clean my room. How do I start a task like cleaning my room? How do I learn to pay better attention when I'm having a discussion with mom and dad? All of these things are generally taught as we're growing up. But if the brain is underdeveloped and the centers for learning this, especially in the frontal lobes, are not functioning the way they should be, well, sometimes it just ends up that I miss them entirely, or they're just very weak. And this again is empowering to you, because if you're frustrated with your child coming home with inconsistencies or just terrible performance or an inability to regulate their emotions, then we can't get mad at them. It is their brain that is not functioning the way you need it to function, or they need it to function. But yelling and being frustrated will not change that. Does that make sense? I mean, it's really important. Um, it's really important to understand that. And Ambra says, I didn't realize that my brain was slower in development. Doesn't mean that you're not intelligent. It doesn't mean that by any understanding of this. Does not mean that you are less intelligent. As a matter of fact, I found that ADHD people are as intelligent or more intelligent than their neurotypicals because of neuroplasticity. They can't do these things that help them function in a normal environment, in a loving relationship even. They have a very difficult time. It doesn't mean they're not intelligent, highly intelligent, but they're weak in these areas. That doesn't make them dumb, doesn't make them stupid. Typically, the brain will adapt in other ways. That's why people say, well, I'm ADHD, but I really can think outside the box. And typically you do, because you had trouble in all of those areas we just talked about. So the brain has to think of some other way to try to coping mechanisms, right? So those typically happen. But does that help me in my personal relationships to my better half? No. I have to learn what those executive functions are in order to be able to do that. So can anyone answer these questions? Is ADHD a hopeless state? Does my age make me hopeless? I can't get any better. Does autism, does TBI, does stroke, PTSD, whatever? Does that make me, knowing what you know? Toby says, absolutely not. And that is correct. You are not in any way hopeless. You can make change. And that is all based on neuroplasticity. I hope that makes sense. We now see that we can, but it does take work in order to do it. And that's the problem when we start talking about making change, right? Making change like losing weight. It takes work. It takes a lot of work, right? Being able to learn how to program a computer takes a lot of work. Even whenever we're learning even a new language, it is not like the Matrix where they can plug in something into your head and all of a sudden I know Kung Fu. I know Spanish. It doesn't happen that way, right? So when we do this, and Kevin has a good point here, and he's saying, well, a lot of this allows us to make excuses. It does. It does allow you to make excuses, although excuses do not affect change, right? And by affect, I mean do not promote change. And this is one of the important issues here. If we want to make change, we have to undergo a course that will augment the brain, that will change the brain. And this is the important part of today's webinar, right? And I'm going to give you examples. Number one example I gave you was myself and learning how to use these new knees faster than, one of the PTs that actually you get a couple of months of PTs coming to your house once you have a bilateral knee replacement, 2 knees replaced at one time. And at the end of her visits with me, the chief of staff for the PTs said, I've been at this 27 years. I have never seen anybody as far ahead as you are. And again, it is the fact that I understand neuroplasticity. I understand what it's going to take to make this happen. And so I do everything I can in my power to do that. And the PTs are here to coach me on how to do that. So this is work. And I can tell you at times it's very painful work. All right, so you have my example. Now, taxi cab drivers. Back in 2013, Queen's College in London decided to look at the brains of taxi cab drivers. And you would say, why in the world would you look at taxi cab drivers? This is an interesting study. In Queen's College, taxi cab drivers were studied because in London is a very old city, right? It's not laid out in the matrix the way that New York City is laid out, right? New York City is reasonably easy to navigate. You have avenues going one direction, you have streets going another direction. And it's laid out in a matrix. So you can pick out any street corner you want and you can get there pretty easily. But London is so old that many streets are too narrow for a car to get through. And there aren't many streets that are widely known. There are many streets that are known in certain neighborhoods. So it's a very difficult way, a method that they have to undergo. So to be a taxi cab driver, to drive in those little black cabs you may have seen in movies, or if you visited London, you could see the little traditional black cabs that were driving at that time. They didn't have GPS as we do now on our phones. So to become a taxi cab driver at that time, you had to apprentice for 2 to 3 years with another driver. And so they looked at the brains of these drivers pre and post training. And then some of the drivers who'd been in the field much longer than that. It was quite interesting because the scientists at Queen's College in London knew that in order for them to understand, because a good taxi cab driver without any GPS can show you the quickest route to get to your destination, your desired destination in London. No extra computer necessary. It's all here. This was a fantastic study. It was really brilliant. So they took MRIs of the hippocampus, right? The hippocampi of various, and the hippocampi is just the plural of a hippocampus. They took the MRI to see if this thing was changing, because it's the center of memory and learning. So if they are learning, did it actually rewire that? Did it actually change the physical size of it? And they found that in the novices, compared to the people that had finished, or to the novice that went through the 2 or 3 years and then they did the MRI after that time, areas of the hippocampus were nearly twice the size as they were when they previously measured them. Now that's neuroplasticity in a nutshell. It is changing the actual wiring of the brain. Is this making sense now? It is actually changing it in a way that changes its size, its configuration. So it is allowing me to functionally and physically change my brain. This is absolute, when you understand this and you really grasp this, not just intellectually, but you understand this in your heart, in your whole being, that I am the commander here. I can make change. That's everything that neuroplasticity is promising, right? And Tammy, we will make this whole webinar available tomorrow. We'll have it out in an email to everyone so that you can rewatch it if you like. There will be a link sent out to everyone to be able to see the whole thing, especially if you're here late. No worries. So one of the things that we're talking about here in examples is that we can physically modify the brain to get it to do the things that we need to do. And if that's executive function, we'll discuss that later, we can do it. But it, again, takes takes so much work to do it. And we'll talk about that. All right. So if we were not able to change the functional and structural abilities of the brain, we wouldn't have school. There would be no need for school, would there? Because, my background is actually education. I have a master's in education. But there was never a time in my planning book when I'm writing a lesson plan. I would never write in, due to neuroplasticity, I am going to change the way the children's brains function by doing this and this and this, right? I never wrote that. But that is the duty of every school teacher. So we've known that we never had a label for it, right? 100 years ago, no one was talking about neuroplasticity. But now we have a name for it because we know how it works on this level. When we're teaching, I know exactly what it took to entice my students to learn, to do more, to learn more. And we also know now in experiments, monocular vision is one of the primary tests they used in a lab. So monocular vision is to take a lab rat, for example, and you're going to sew its eyes shut in a humane way. One eye will be sewn shut. So when that eye loses sight, the brain starts to rewire and it strengthens the functioning eye. This is called a test of monocular vision. Right? So it is amazing to see that we can actually promote it in a mouse's brain or a rat's brain, but it's the same thing that's happening in a human brain. Monocular vision test, take this eye, close it, and then the other eye starts strengthening. Now, the exact opposite is true when you allow the other eye to function. So when they saw that the other eye strengthened and they could see in the rat's brain that the synapses were stronger on the functional eye, they then opened the eye and made it functional. And what happened? Because neuroplasticity is going to occur again. It's very transactional, right? And this is my last bullet point. It requires stimulation. So they now allow this eye to open and it's stimulated again. So the transaction goes back. So this eye will diminish a little bit because it was over strengthened. And now it will diminish a little bit. And this one will strengthen. Again, examples of neuroplasticity over and over again. It's transactional. It's loading some where this one stops functioning and then unloading it and bringing it back. So it's rather transactional. I hope that makes sense for all of you. So how do we spark neuroplasticity, right? And one of the keys to this is that we're looking at it on the overall macro, over the general large view. So sparking basically requires a need or desire to change. If I'm a human being and I have ADHD, I have had a stroke, I have autism, and I want to make some differences in the way my brain functions, especially in executive function, I have a desire or need to. Many of you here are here for this reason. There are critical catalysts. After I know there is the desire, there is an internal drive that initiates this, right? That is what motivates me. So once I know this, I have to have enough attention paid to this problem so that my brain starts saying, oh, there's something I need to do. If I don't pay attention, and it's just like learning something in class. If the teacher is trying to impart information and you're sometimes looking out the window and sometimes you're, tapping the table and sometimes you're listening to people out in the hall, there's not enough attention, you're not going to get everything the teacher imparts. So attention is one of those catalysts. If we're going to spark this fire, one of the catalysts we need is attention. That's, the match that starts to light all of this. Then we have to be challenged. All right. If I tell you something you already know, it simply elicits memory, right? You just say, oh, I already know. I don't know. I don't need that. So there's no challenge. If I present you with a challenge, and some of the information you're receiving today is rather challenging to you, didn't know it. Holy cow, that's an aha moment. And so if you're presented with a challenge, something you don't have, and the brain's trying to get, then the brain starts the process internally of amping up, of rewiring. So I have to have enough attention to a challenging situation, and then I have to use this thing called deliberate practice. All right, so this is very important. Deliberate practice is different than just practice. Deliberate practice is a term coined by Dr. Anders Ericsson. You can look him up later, but he is the guru of talking about how people make significant change that lasts. And he looked at figure skaters, he looked at tons of professionals. And it was interesting to note in the figure skaters that the people who were higher performing than their peers, the ones that were winning Olympic championships, were practicing the most dangerous moves, most complex moves they had far more than their peers. And this is the difference between deliberate practice and just practice, right? If we're good at something, decent, we'll just practice it over and over and over again, and we remain decent. If you want to be a superstar, and as an ADHD person, you want to have superstar executive function, then you have to deliver. There's the work, right? Deliberate practice means work. And it means that I can't just practice the same thing over and over again, because that's what got me where I am right now. I need to practice on a higher level. So when Ericsson was watching the figure skaters, where you throw your partner up in the air and typically she will spin 3 or 4 times and catch her. And of course, if you fail to catch correctly or she lands wrong, she could be significantly hurt. They practice this far more than their peers. And he found that the difference is that they were getting this immediate feedback about the move, because they could see it in real time, feel it. And then they knew the adjustments to make. They would very quickly say, okay, we did it this way. Let's try this to see if it's better. So they tried and set a little mini goal, and then they were they reached new heights of ability. And this is crazy when you think about it, but the challenge is there. The brain needs to accommodate it. And then I deliberately practice that over and over again, which is not just practicing being mediocre. It's challenging yourself to go a little further. Again, I hope this resonates within you and you understand where we're going with this and how it affects you personally, right? So sparking neuroplasticity on a grand level, right? We know as teachers, this is exactly what we need to do. We need to know there is a new function that's necessary, right? Then I have to give stimulation. That initiates the transaction. And this initiation is basically my challenge section, right? When I'm initiating, it's challenge and attention. I know I want to increase my ability to control my impulsivity. Impulsivity has gotten me nowhere except in trouble. So I need to be able to work on that. Now that in itself is difficult, and I'll describe how we do it later, but this is something I recognize immediately that I must do. I have to have enough attention to that. I am motivated to do it now. I know there's a sense of change that I can make, but then I have to have work that must be done from start to finish so that this new skill is in my brain and it is in my control. And I know this sounds complex, so I'm going to make it easier. Remember I said I tend to base my webinars too much on the science side, so I'm going to make this really easier for you to understand, for those of you that may be a little confused. So if I wanted to put an addition onto my house, because here's the need, right? I want to have more space to be creative, to have freedom in my house, to have some privacy for myself, to get away from the kids. So I think building an addition to the house would be good, right? So now I've assessed that there needs to be a change. And so typically I can't do this by myself. So I hire a conductor to come in and help with this transaction that I have to do. And if this house, the extension of the house, the addition of to the house is going to be fully functional, and again, think of the function in your brain, I have to have wiring to it. So I'm going to get good internet, good cable TV, electricity, right? I need all of that. And I'll probably need connections so that it has some type of air conditioning in it, either heat or AC or something for me in there. So we're looking at, and probably telephone. You know, some of us still have, I still have a landline as well as a cell line. So I need all those connections to be made. So there is the understanding there is a need to happen, right? I need this to work for me to enhance my life. Same thing as if I'm learning an executive function. Now, I have to have a way to do it. So I actually hire this conductor. It's what we call a contractor. And the contractor comes in, he goes, oh, well, let's work together and we'll plan and organize how big this thing is supposed to be, what it's supposed to look like, right? So we're working together. And by the way, I'm describing to you the way we do it in Play Attention, right? We design a program together, and then we guide you through how we rewire, which is exactly what the contractor is doing to rewire and to build this new extension to your house. It makes it that much simpler to understand so that we have this, we work out the plan together. And then, of course, the contractor, which would be Play Attention in this play, you know, in this metaphor, comes in and shows you how this is done. How do you do it? This is how we do it. This is how you get from here to here. And this is exactly what you do if you're building a house. Think of it as the extension of your brain. Does that resonate? Does that make sense? Or is it too abstract a metaphor? Raise your hand if it makes sense. Okay, terrific. Thank you. All right. So little things that you can do right now to spark your neuroplasticity, or maybe your child's learning. Learning starts brain changing. Remember, it still takes attention, right? Still make certain that it takes challenge and it takes practice, right? And you have to remember the practice is very similar to make it make more sense from the previous slide. If the contractor, and you know, this is the deliberate practice module, if the contractor does not complete his work, is that going to be fully functional? The answer is that if the contractor does not complete his work on that extension, no, it will not work. Right. That's correct. Everybody's saying, no, it's not going to work. It's not finished. It's not going to work fully. So the deliberate practice is something we must do so that we have those full changes in the brain. All right. So one of the things we can do right now is learn a new language, learn a new way to get around, learn, you know, instead of using your GPS system in your car, maybe you could memorize how you get to a certain location you go to, and it's now in your brain. Challenge yourself to remember it. Learning a new language is an excellent way to increase your brain's capacity. In child development, you can develop language and communication skills. Have them talk to you about emotions like fear, anger, joy, happiness, having fun. What is that? How does that make you feel? Because when you do that, new connections are made in the brain. In everyday activities, you can remember names, create art, understand new rules. Those are all basic ways to understand how neuroplasticity actually works. Matter of fact, if you know you have a very young child, even just using little post-it notes under a light switch that they'll use, and you have the words light switch underneath the light switch, that'll help them understand when they see those words, when they start to read, yeah, oh, that was light switch, right? Another one is bathroom, kitchen. Those kinds of things actually develop the way the brain will function. Sleep is one of the primary factors in how information is stored from the brain, and then memories are formed. So if you're not getting enough sleep, neuroplasticity is very, very difficult. Get good sleep. So if you are exercising, that's another fantastic way to spark neuroplasticity. As a matter of fact, some of the things that I'll talk to you about actually, the chemicals that are produced for neuroplasticity, actually, some of them come from your muscle tissue. Try using, I'm left-handed, so if I wanted to try something to develop neuroplasticity, maybe I'd try brushing my teeth with my right hand, try combing my hair with my right hand, since I am left-handed. If you're right-handed, you would try with your left hand. That also promotes it. Music. A lot of research has been done on musicians. My brother is a very, very, very good musician, was with the Cleveland Orchestra for the longest time, one of the best orchestras in the world. And they actually have higher rates of connections, of neural connections and rates of neuroplasticity than non-musicians. So learning music, learning an instrument, all great ways to spark your neuroplasticity. So now we're going to dive into this. I'm running short on time because we're supposed to wrap it up here around 2. But let's talk about how this is done on the micro level, chemically, in the brain, molecules in the brain. And I'm going to make this quick because it's not just complex, but it's a little bit harder to understand. So I'll go through this quickly, but hopefully you'll understand it. There, BDNF, right? Brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's protein in the body. And then it is part of the development of the spinal cord. And remember, the spinal cord, as we said previously, is part of this massive computer that is attached to every other portion of the body. Is everybody with me? So it helps develop the spinal cord, which is one of the part of the messenger service that connects all of the rest of the body to the brain, to the gray matter, which does the processing, to the white matter that takes that information and passes it to the central nervous system, what we call the CNS. It helps regulate your neuroplasticity, right? And they adapt in time, right, to the need for change and that our experiences that teach us how to make those changes. It's very difficult for us to make change unless we are paying attention, getting challenged, and we do use deliberate practice. All right. So BDNF is a key regulator of behavior. So if you're working with your child that doesn't behave well and their brain is slightly delayed, they just don't have that function yet. They can learn it, they can develop it, but there has to be a method to do that. It's involved in cognitive functions such as memory, acquisition, and consolidation. So it's part of the family of microsystems that change the actual structure of the brain as well. So we are talking, just as we were talking about rewiring that house and creating the extension, these actual rewiring situations are occurring in the brain. Now, it's not metal wire, but it's nerves and tissue that will support the new function that we're asking the brain to do, just like we were talking when we were talking about building the extension to the house. Another series of events that require transcription is the Krebs cycle. And I'm going to keep this as simple as possible. The cyclic AMP response, elements and binding protein. So when you are actually challenged to learn something new, the brain is very much like building that new portion of the house. They hire a contractor. We would hire a contractor to build that new portion of the house. The brain actually uses the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle actually does this thing called transcription. So it actually hires the contractor to go out and rebuild that new portion of the brain. So in Krebs, essentially, it lets loose this thing called RNA, right? And RNA molecules, and it transcribes DNA, the basic coding of you as a human being, DNA, our coding as human beings, our genetic coding, sends out a transcript into an RNA module, or molecule, excuse me. That messenger RNA goes to the brain and said, hey, got to rewire here so that Peter can learn Spanish. As he's learning Spanish, we'll wire it more and more. So this provides both structural, just like we're talking about in the house, structural and functional changes in the house, structural and functional changes to my brain. All of that requires, again, like I said before, attention, challenge, and doing the work till it's completed. Make sense? Kind of fun, isn't it? To learn that we are in charge. It's kind of fun to know that we are empowered to make change. All right. So again, I'll just review this because I already talked about it a little bit. All of these are executive functions, usually frontal lobe, all over the brain, but primarily organized and regulated in the frontal lobes. If these are delayed, are we hopeless? The answer to that a while ago was absolutely not. We are not hopeless. We can make significant changes. And that's the point of this, right? We can do it. If the brain has difficulty in it, then how do we obtain this? And this is what I was talking about with play attention. We actually put neurotech on your arm, so it allows you to see your attention in real time. And when we're doing that, we give you games, they're gamified, they're skills that you will control by your brain alone. You'll actually move things on the screen by brain alone. And it teaches you, each one of the games that you do will teach you impulse control, short-term memory, working memory, planning, organization, how to increase and sustain your attention. So I started that nearly 30, this year would be 30 years ago, and how we do it. So it's developed so much since then. And it's been tested 3 times by Tufts University School of Medicine, published in medical journals. So we know what we're doing. We do it really well. But again, this all basically addresses the fact that in order to do this, you have to have the right tools. Otherwise, we sit and we go, well, how am I supposed to learn that? How do I get that? How do I develop it? And that was the whole idea behind me creating Play Attention, so that you have a significant way, right, to do this, to get the tools that will help you build the skills that you don't have. That's based on neuroplasticity. Make sense? Again, many great things. Really appreciate it. Take care, everyone. Thank you.